חיובי. ואני חושבת שאפילו מה שדובר כעת, מצרים, 8-9 חטופים, איך אנחנו בכלל יכולים להעלות על עצמנו תרחיש כזה, ועוד להישאר אחר כך עם שוב חטופים, ושוב השיח הזה, אנחנו לא מצליחים לצאת מהפלונטר הזה, החברה הישראלית לא תוכל לשאת את זה עוד הרבה זמן.
אני רוצה לחזור דווקא לנושא החוץ. כל הבעיה העיקרית של החוצים משנת 2014 בהורדת הסובסידיות של ממשלת תימן של עדי על הדלקים. מאז החות'ים התחילו מה שנקרא להשתגע בכל האזור של תימן והים האדום. הבעיה החות'ית בעיקרה היא בעיה שהחות'ים 30% כמעט מהחברה התימנית. הבעיה העיקרית שלהם היא בעיה כלכלית. ארצות הברית של אמריקה עוד בזמנו יכלה לפתור את הבעיה הזאת אם הייתה מורידה את הבעיה הקשה הזאת של אזור באב אל-מנדב במיסוי על אוניות. מה שהחבר'ה האלה בגדול מבקשים זה פתרונות כלכליים. בהיעדר פתרונות כלכליים איראן נכנסת לאזורים האלה ומתחילה להשקיע שם מיליוני דולרים שקיבלו מתנה משלטון אובמה וקודמיו. אם העולם המערבי לא ישכיל להבין שאיראן דוחפת את הגרורות הסרטניות שלה לכל מדינה.
What we are seeing in our numbers of the first quarter is a good level of activities for corporates, clearly. And what we are progressively seeing also in the, I would say, more day-to-day figures is a pickup in the credit demand in retail activities in France, from household for home loans, but also to a certain extent for some sectors. So we are positive again for the rest of the year, of course, depending on the final outcome of all these discussions that are taking place around tariffs, around geopolitics, and so on and so forth.
Jim, that's really interesting. Thanks very much, Dee, for updating us. Thank you very much, Dee, for spending so much time with us as well this morning. Jerome Grevet, the Deputy CEO of Credit Agricole. Okay, so we've got an idea of what is happening in the French economy. Interesting what he had to say about what is happening in terms of credit demand for small and medium-sized companies and also the consumer. The inflation picture, though, obviously comes towards all of this as a big factor as we think about what is going to happen next. We are going to get very shortly. We'll be coming back in a few minutes' time and breaking that data. We'll also look at all of the earnings we've had out this morning. The auto sector very much in focus as well. We'll talk about what is happening there. This is Bloomberg.
מתי כשאני מדבר? שומעים כשאני מדבר? שומעים או לא שומעים? 1, 2, 3, 4.
DraftKings hit a milestone in the second quarter of 2024. For the first time as a public company, it turned a profit.
Is this a new era for DraftKings?
There's an inflection from when you're cash flow negative and you're operating off of equity raises from the past to when you're self-funded and you're cash flow positive.
And left the scene. But that cell phone expert sort of had some rebuttal to that, saying that they didn't find any data to suggest that John had ever gone inside the home. And also a piece that was interesting, they talked about it registering that he was going up a flight of stairs or going down a flight of stairs. They were talking a bit about whether or not Apple is even accurate in that information, or whether or not that could have been him driving up and down a hill, which is something we also know had to happen in order for them to reach the Albert's home.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is one of these situations where it's dueling experts. It's the prosecution presenting their expert to say that there is no evidence that O'Keefe ever went inside the home and that the data was so lacking that they can't make that determination. On the other hand, it's good enough that they can determine that he was in the vicinity of the flagpole. On the other hand, you have the defense who has a great deal of information, has been down this road before, has their own experts, and is saying that the data obtained from the phone is certainly sufficient to indicate that indeed O'Keefe was in the home and that is what that stare data reflects as well.
And so I want to put up some of these images as well as they were talking about that infamous area outside. So many eyes in court were focused right here. As you can see there on your screen, that's the area that they've been highlighting. I have to ask you, Nicole, as a
אחד, שתיים, שלוש, ארבע, חמש, שש, שבע, שמונה.
if it's plausible that Karen could have hit John versus thinking this whole thing is a cover-up.
Well, I think it's incredibly important because if they don't believe, the jurors don't believe that O'Keefe ever made it inside the house, then the defense's story, their whole defense really is not going to ring true with a juror who believes the expert when the expert says there is no evidence that O'Keefe went inside the house. On the other hand, you can see from these overlapping circles that there's the possibility that the phone did indeed ping from within inside the house, and the steps that we're taking are indicative of movement throughout a period in time consistent with that location. So, you know, this may be a subject for debate with jurors. Some jurors may believe one way, others may believe the other, and they're going to ultimately need to debate it out once they get back into that jury room.
All right, let's talk about one of those other witnesses that took the stand today. If you've been following this case, you know the name. Jennifer McCabe. She has been one of the star witnesses for the prosecution as they're trying to paint the picture that, again, Karen hit John. She left the scene and was frantic in the aftermath, asking for Jennifer McCabe's help. But truly, people know her for the search, how long to die in cold, potentially how long to die in the cold with just a misstep as she was typing there. That search has been so controversial. They didn't ask her yet about the search on the stand today, but what other information did they really try to get out of her?
They are trying to get out of her information about the things that Karen Read did and said and her demeanor in the evening when they went to the house and then ultimately found O'Keefe's body. So that's one of the things they really want her to paint a picture of for this jury. And that search is really going to be critical because there's some debate with the expert about the timing of that search and what has been presented as evidence in terms of it being maybe around 6:30 in the morning versus around 2:30 in the morning. And one of these times is in advance of O'Keefe's death, and the one is clearly after. So that is going to be a subject for much debate, along with the types of things that Reed said to McCabe, according to what McCabe is reporting now to this jury.
Exactly. So this is a quote from court. This is what McCabe said that Karen said. She said, Jen, and then she's screaming that John didn't come home. She started saying, could I have hit him? Did I hit him? Those words are going to be a lot for those on the jury to hear. They're going to think maybe that this could potentially point to some sort of guilt.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's possible, and certainly the prosecution is going to paint it as an admission that she was telling her friend that she had possibly hit O'Keefe or was acknowledging it, and that her level of stress about him not coming home after their evening out was consistent with ultimately what they claim to be a search by her on McCabe's phone, how long to die in the cold, along with the comments that she was making to McCabe about did I hit him and did I hit him?
And we're looking here at some of the footage that came from the night out. I think it's important, Nicole, to point out some of the facts in this case. We all know that the folks who were involved, even Jennifer McCabe, as she's there on the witness stand, they were somewhat inebriated by alcohol. They had spent the night out drinking, visiting several bars there in the area. How is that going to affect their recollection there on the stand, or even how the jury perceives them as witnesses? Do they think that they could be accurate in their recollection of things, being that they all had alcohol in their systems?
Such a good point. And that is going to be up to each individual juror to assess what they think the credibility of every single witness that hits that stand is. And certainly alcohol affects the ability of a witness to recall and then to ultimately testify about what they think they remember from that evening. Keep in mind, two, these witnesses have talked to the police. McCabe has talked to multiple people prior to trial and has testified before. So this is going to give quite a bit of room for extensive cross-examination by the defense.
And let's talk about cross-examination. Of course, we know that on her team, Karen Reed has Alan Jackson, the famed lawyer that's from Los Angeles. He was there in her first trial, sitting next to her again and leading this defense. But what makes this trial different is that it is a retrial on the same charges. How much more difficult is it for a defense team and their method going in, knowing that whatever they said the first time didn't get their client off? In fact, all it got was a mistrial.
Well, on the one hand, it is more difficult because you've already now revealed to the prosecution how you're going to process the evidence that they have presented to the jury to show guilt. In other words, you've already let the cat out of the bag. You've given them all the information about all of the cross-examination and all of the ways that you are going to take what the prosecution has presented and turn it around and show that, in fact, the evidence they presented shows that the defense is correct and that perhaps the defense is innocent. Karen Reed is innocent. This is all already out there, and the prosecution is going to have the opportunity to prepare the jury for the cross by direct examination on the points they're concerned about. So it is very challenging for the defense because so much has already been revealed.
So much has been revealed, and yet still so much to continue to be revealed in this case. Before I let you go, I want to point to one thing that happened last week in the trial. One of the main witnesses as well that they had there recanted a statement where she said she heard Karen Reed ask Jennifer McCabe to conduct that search. Do you think that we'll finally get some of the answers to the how long to die in the cold once this continues on?
I think that we'll get more answers. I think that it'll be, more information, and it'll be interesting to hear how the defense addresses that. Certainly, multiple police interviews down the road as they investigated this case, a whole trial went by. The defense is certainly going to want to inquire as to why this witness now is coming forward with this information, which seems pretty critical and important in the determination of credibility of these witnesses.
And lastly, Nicole, we also know that Karen Reed's team, they had appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court to get some of these charges thrown out. Ultimately, the Supreme Court denied that. Does that mean that whatever happens in this case moves forward? Does she still have grounds for an appeal if she's found guilty after this? Or is this the end of the road as it pertains to that?
She absolutely has grounds for appeal. And this is an excellent defense team that is doing everything that they can do to make their complaints on the record and make the judge hear these complaints and then issue rulings as she listens to what they have to say. And so they're preserving issues in the event that Karen Reed is found guilty. There will absolutely be an appeal based on the excellent evidentiary objections and issues that they've been raising.
All right, legal analyst Nicole DeBoard helping us to break down the very latest in the Karen Reed trial. Anything else that you're looking out for this week that folks who are at home and tuned into this trial should be paying attention to?
I will definitely be looking out for information which is either inconsistent with or in addition to testimony or evidence which has already been presented in the first trial. So I'm very curious to hear what the potential differences are as these witnesses testify and we hear more evidence.
All right, we'll certainly keep our eyes on this case as well. Again, legal analyst Nicole DeBoard here to help us with the very latest in the Karen Reed trial. We appreciate you for joining us.
These are hugely welcomed, but a coordinated approach to prevent this happening in the first place is what needs to be prioritised.
And just talk us through what steps you think should be in place to protect Hode's wood.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
What steps do you think should be in place to protect Hode's
Thanks for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Christina Evans. Let's turn our attention to one of the other top stories that's making headlines on the internet, especially. We've got to talk about the famed coach, Bill Belichick. Of course, you know him for everything that's done out there on the football field. But right now, he's making headlines for something else. I want to put this up on your screen from our partners there at TMZ. We're talking about this disastrous CBS Mornings interview where Bill Belichick was there to promote his new book, The Art of Winning. But folks are focusing on something else altogether. We're talking about his girlfriend there, Jordan Hudson. There was an incident that happened while they were shooting the interview, and to talk a lot more about it, I want to bring into the conversation with TMZ, Michael Babcock. Michael, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, Christina, anytime. Thanks for having me.
All right, we have to talk about this interview and how bizarre it went. Things seemed to take a left turn when Bill was asked about the relationship between him and his now girlfriend, who is significantly younger than him. What can you tell us about what happened there in the interview?
Yeah, she is near 50 years younger than he is. Bill Belichick, 73 years old, and Jordan Hudson's 24 years old. Now, this is really the first time that Bill has sat down and given an interview. We've seen him work on television in his role as an analyst, but nothing where he was sitting down and actually answering questions. So he answers questions about his book, about his coaching career. But when it gets to that one moment, that one question where they ask about the origin of his relationship with Jordan Hudson, that's when she stepped in, Christina. And a lot of people now have probably seen the video, and it was an awkward moment without a doubt. It was not the only awkward moment, though. It just happened to be the only awkward moment that CBS chose to keep in the final piece. We were told, though, that Jordan, on multiple occasions, she stepped in during the interview and stopped Bill from answering questions or corrected the interviewer. And she really made her presence known. And it wasn't only about personal stuff. This is when they're talking about football related questions even, and she would step in. As a matter of fact, we were told that she got so frustrated with the interview at one point that she actually ended up leaving for something like a half hour, delaying the entire shoot. She ultimately comes back, and the CBS reporter says, hey, look, one more question and I'm out of here, because this has just gotten to be too strange, too weird. And they actually cut the interview short. Now, this is a guy who never talks in Bill Belichick. They had an opportunity to talk to him, but it was so strange that CBS is literally the ones who pulled the plug on the interview.
And it's interesting, we're showing some of that video from what Bill's new job is. He's going to be the head coach at University of North Carolina, UNC. Those Tar Heels were really excited to have him on campus. But what do you think happens from here? It seems like his relationship is starting to really impact how people view him. And when you're a football team that needs a lot of help, you don't really want the attention on your coach's girlfriend and not what's on their playbook and what they're planning to do this season.
Right. I think that is a great point. The goal ultimately with Bill Belichick going to UNC was that, hey, maybe they can compete for national championships. And that's not something that school and that program has traditionally been able to do. But now you've got this guy who's got 1 million Super Bowls to his name, and you say, okay, maybe this is the turning point for the program. But now there is a lot of concern around the program and around the university, Christina, because of some of the things that have happened with Jordan Hudson and Bill. It's not only the CBS interview. There were things that were happening beforehand, but this, I think, was the cherry on top for a lot of people who said, does she have too much say here? Does she have too much impact over what Bill says, what he doesn't say, what happens and doesn't happen? And there is real concern on the campus there in North Carolina now that she is far too involved, and I'm not so sure that they all like it very much.
I got to ask you, Michael, before I let you go, have we heard from them directly at this point? Have we heard from Jordan, his girlfriend, or Bill speaking out in response to this interview? They got to give us something at this point to understand what happened there behind the scenes.
So the question that she interrupted or stepped in on was a question about the origin of their relationship. She has, since the interview aired and since the controversy kicked off, she has posted a photo, Christina, of a book. Now, the book is something called Deductive Logic. You say, okay, well, who cares about that book? Well, that's the book that her and Bill are said to have bonded over on a flight in February of 2021, which was really the thing that kicked off their relationship. They got to talking, they liked each other, and they ultimately began dating. So I think the message is very clear that Jordan's saying, hey, look, I know we didn't answer the question on CBS, but here is how we met. There's no crazy backstory. There's no other lie that we haven't told you. This is actually how we met. It was over this book. So that's what she posted on social media. Also, last night, Monday night in New York City, we got word of where they were going to be. So we had one of our camera people outside of their hotel as they got in their car. They were not in the mood to talk. Bill Belichick, Jordan Hudson, hotel lobby, straight into the car. They didn't say a peep. So they have not been very talkative since the CBS interview aired.
I was going to say, kind of similar to how it seems they left the CBS interview as well. Not in the mood to talk about anything more that had anything to do personally. All right, we did want to thank you again. This is
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. אחד, שתיים, שלוש, אחד, שתיים, שלוש, אחד, שתיים, שלוש. אחד, שתיים, שלוש, אחד, שתיים, שלוש, אחד, שתיים, שלוש.
Shipping company UPS announcing earlier today that it plans to cut 20,000 jobs this year, in addition to closing 73 of its facilities. The company says the decision is due in part to an agreement with Amazon to reduce the volume of packages by 50%. Amazon is UPS's largest customer, but UPS's CEO says that Amazon's business is not profitable for the company. UPS also says that tariffs and economic insecurity are partially to blame for the downsizing as well. Barron's Al Roots is here to break this down. All right, 20,000 jobs, Al, that's massive. How did UPS get in this hole? Why isn't Amazon profitable for them?
A couple of things. I mean, Amazon's very difficult. Amazon's very large. So to some extent, it's market power, right? Amazon is pretty much the largest e-commerce company on the globe or in the Western world, and it can demand relatively favorable pricing. You know, FedEx doesn't deal with UPS. FedEx doesn't deal with Amazon now. UPS is choosing to take to leave some of Amazon's business off the table. And Amazon also has its own internal, very sophisticated logistics network, so it's shifting some of the volume over there. So some of this is the natural ebb and flow of business, but it's very big. And you asked, how did UPS get itself into this position? I mean, remember, we got to go all the way back to COVID. You know, before COVID, before an e-commerce boom, you know, UPS is doing $75 billion in sales. By 2022, that's like $100 billion in sales. Amazon's, 10 to 15% of the total revenue. And then, like Carol, the CEO Carol Tomé said today, it's not as good as the rest of UPS's business. So they're stepping away from some of it. So they're stepping away from, $5 billion in business, maybe $5 to $10 billion in Amazon business. and that necessitates laying off 20,000 workers. Again, for context, that's roughly 5% of the workforce. UPS has almost 500,000 people working for it.
So the idea of tariffs, Al, continues to spook businesses and consumers. What kind of role are tariffs playing in this UPS news, if any? How does it feel to you?
So I think that today's news, UPS reported earnings today. The layoffs, the Amazon business, that sort of came out in the first quarter, sort of pre-tariffs. So a lot of this cost savings and restructuring is Amazon related. But we saw it in FedEx earnings, and we see it in earnings all over the place. People are still uncertain about the business impact of the tariffs. Remember, they just went into effect in April. A lot of comments about customer conversations and how they're planning to mitigate and move logistics around. So there's part of it. So, for instance, the tariff part of UPS's call, like they basically suspended guidance, and they just talked about the second quarter. Companies usually give people a look into the full year. That's what General Motors did. Other companies have done the same. So they're seeing some cost inflation. Their customers are maybe stepping back or trying to redo logistics. But from a tariff perspective, we're still in the very early innings of the impacts and trying to figure out what businesses are going to do.
So, Al, one other big thing that happened today, I know this is probably something that you've had your eye on as well. Amazon was in the news today for another reason. Punchbowl News reporting that Amazon was considering displaying the cost of U.S. tariffs next to certain products online. The Trump administration called that a hostile and political act. Ultimately, Amazon saying themselves that this will not be happening, but Al, sometimes when these things leak out, sometimes there's negotiating in the public going on. Does it feel like something like that's happening here, or is that a bit of a stretch?
I think so. I think that's accurate. I think to some extent, Amazon is in some respect at the heart of the tariff. They import a lot of stuff from Asian countries, China, Vietnam, shoes, clothing. A lot of that stuff is made in Asia. And it faces substantial tariffs. Amazon's sort of responsible for paying those tariffs. So instead of raising prices, they came up with this great idea. We'll just, show a tariff line item, and we'll show people that, we haven't changed our prices. We're not making any more money. Administration wasn't happy about that. Stuff like this has been tried before. If you go back to airlines, when fuel prices go up and down, or sometimes from taxes, ticket taxes and things like this, or landing fees at airports. Airlines have tried to say, well, look at your ticket. We're not making much money. Look, it's all airport fees, or it's all fuel expense. The bottom line, again, from Amazon perspective, it's trying to figure out how to mitigate costs, any potential cost increases from tariffs, how much it can pass along to the consumer, what will that do to its business. So, it was like an idea they floated, and let's just say the idea landed like a lead balloon.
So you touched on something, and this was exactly what I wanted to ask, is do you foresee, if something like this were to be implemented, whether it's Amazon, whether it's another online retailer, putting tariff prices next to items, do you see that changing consumer behavior?
Well, no, ultimately price will change consumer behavior, right? So if we go back to like the price of a car, and there were some tariff changes today. But the consensus estimate was like tariffs could increase costs by $5,000 or $10,000. Then there were some changes made today. Tariffs could increase the cost of cars maybe $2,000 to $5,000 now. So not as severe, but it's still a cost increase. So that's what changes consumer behavior, right? So maybe you have to buy used, maybe you wait to buy a new car, maybe you go with a lower end car. Those are the sorts of the changes, right? Like you, me, everybody else, we're all just sort of trying, I'm doing it very unsuccessfully, mind you, to make our checkbooks balance. And so that's what really changes consumer behavior. The fact that, there's a tariff, go back to that airline example. I'm either going to Chicago because I can afford the ticket. I don't really care if there's the fuel expense is up. I can either afford it or I can't. So price is ultimately what's going to change consumer behavior. And again, we're sort of still in those early innings of how much inflation, price increase, cost increase can be mitigated? What's going to be the final end game? It's just, I mean, we're still like, we're less than 4 weeks into this sort of tariff idea.
Thanks, Al. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Let's slide away for a quick break. Live look at the White House on this Tuesday evening, just about 10:15 in the nation's capital, 7:15 out west. We're back in a moment. Welcome back and alive now. I'm Austin Westfall. We, of course, yesterday, were tracking so closely the results of yesterday's big election in Canada. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's Liberal Party taking the win, capping a turnaround in fortunes fueled by President Trump's annexation threats and trade policies. Dr. Donald Gill is an assistant professor of Canadian politics at Concordia University in Montreal. As always, it's good to see you. So, Donald, what now? What is Carney's first priority now that he's won?
Well, Mr. Carney has a lot on his...
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
It really turned around the fortunes of the Liberal Party that, under the previous leader, Justin Trudeau, who had been Prime Minister since 2015, was in really, really rough shape at the end of 2024 and the beginning of this current year, 2025. It really looked like 10 years in power, a lot of attrition, scandals built up over time, and just an incredibly unpopular leader in Justin Trudeau made it so that the Liberal Party had no shot at forming government whenever the next election came. Mr. Carney showed up as the successor to Mr. Trudeau, and the American President Donald Trump started to make noises about tariffs on the Canadian economy with potentially an eye toward annexation, and that really changed the game in Canada politically. Gigantic rebound in polling, and Mr. Carney called an election in the expectation that he would be sort of in a position to be able to form a government. He squeaked out a minority government in the end. Some of the campaign sort of shifted. There was an ebb and flow to whether the Liberals or the Conservatives, who are the party expected to form government before the Liberal return under Mark Carney, with the sort of figure of Trump looming over Canada. The Conservative Party under their leader Pierre Poilievre were campaigning on a sort of a different ballot question. For the Liberal Party, it was really all about the annexation threats, the relationship economically with the United States. For the Conservatives, more of just a traditional change message that, are you better off now than you were 10 years ago? If not, if cost of living, inflation, and other sort of affordability metrics are making your life challenging, then, you should switch out the red team, which in Canada is the Liberals, or the blue team, which in Canada is the Conservatives. And so what Mark Carney's going to have to do going forward now that he has a minority mandate, which means he has enough seats to likely command the confidence of the House of Commons, which is the name of our lower house in our parliamentary system, but not enough to be able to pass any legislation he wanted at any time. He's going to have to, first of all, focus on the relationship with the United States. That was his big promise, that as a former central banker and something of a financial wizard, he was the sort of critical piece in the Canadian puzzle to be able to make Canada's economy Trump-proof. But he's also going to have to tackle those other issues that the Conservatives were forcing onto the ballot and really putting in front of Canadians in the election yesterday, because the Conservative Party did actually very well. They ended up with 41.3% of the popular vote and got 144 seats to the Liberals' 169. So they ended up with a very strong performance, and the issues that they put front and center, especially the cost of housing, the cost of groceries, general affordability and cost of living concerns, drug addiction and policy around that, those matters will also have to be dealt with. And so Mark Carney's got a very difficult balancing act to do, where he has to sort of think both macroeconomically and deal with sort of intractable kitchen table bread and butter issues, which can be, government killers on a good day.
Let's talk a little bit about the Conservative Party. So, party leader, Pierre Poilievre, as you alluded to, he not only lost the federal election, he was also voted out of his seat in Parliament, by the way. Donald, there was a point at which Poilievre led the Liberals in federal polls, correct? How much responsibility for the change in opinion lands on Trump?
I mean, almost everything. Honestly, it's very difficult to overstate how much of a sea change in Canadian politics took place from January 20th onwards. I mean, to some degree, when Trump won the election in the United States on November 5th, there were some, noises coming out of Mar-a-Lago about tariffs on Canada, some discussion of the potential of the 51st state. But at that time, it was sort of not immediately obvious to people in Canada whether or not this was something that people were going to take seriously. But really, from the inauguration on January 20th onwards, Canadians started to take quite a hostile view, to be quite frank, and I mean that with the greatest of respect to our American audience here, but take quite a hostile view to the rhetoric emanating out of the White House with regards to Canada, and it made a lot of Canadians who were quite excited by the Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, who has quite a pugilistic, right-wing and populist tone. A lot of Canadians were excited about a sort of an anti-establishment vote, kind of a vote to take down the progressive orthodoxy, which has been sort of quite dominant in Canada under the last 10 years with Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister, and kind of very similar to some of the backlash that occurred in the United States to aspects of what we might call, and I use this term judiciously, I hope, woke overreach. And so Canadians took a second look at Mr. Poilievre in light of what was starting to occur in the United States under the second Trump administration, especially with regards to Canada. And there were some attack ads that were put together by the Liberal Party that showed some of the phrasings of Donald Trump side by side with some of the phrasings of Pierre Poilievre, and this started to chip away at his support. And quite frankly, again, it's astonishing to say that at the beginning of January, the Conservative Party had a 25-point lead in the polls, which would have given them a super majority of the seats in Parliament, kind of almost too many seats, if you can imagine such a thing. And all the way, just a couple of months later, the Liberals end up defeating them 43.7% of the popular vote to 41.3%, and they have a 25-seat advantage in the Parliament, and therefore Liberals, that is, are able to form government. So kind of an unprecedented political comeback, and Pierre Poilievre is woke up this morning rather, not only not Prime Minister, which is something he's been gunning for his whole life, but also booted out of his seat for the riding of Carleton, just outside Canada's capital city, Ottawa. So he's going to have to try to find a new seat for himself via a by-election, and to sort of try to take the fight to the new Mark Carney Liberal government in the House as soon as he can.
Well, let's talk about the White House's annexation threat. Does Carney's win basically squash the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state? Does it put this one to bed?
I mean, from a Canadian's perspective, we certainly hope so. But again, there is it's really a matter for Donald Trump to decide whether or not he wants to respect Canada's sovereignty or not. We are a proud independent nation, have been since 1867. And ultimately, what we elected yesterday was a prime minister who has now been given a mandate to sort of renegotiate the Canada-US relationship with the Trump administration, with respect for our sovereignty at the heart of all that. There's a general consensus across the right to left spectrum in Canadian politics and all across the country that the relationship that we have enjoyed and profited from greatly with the United States over the past 4 decades with increasingly integrated economies is probably no longer viable, not least because of the decisions that the Trump administration have made and continue to make with regards to the reshoring of manufacturing. But just more broadly, the attitude in Canada is one of, as I said to you the last time we spoke, one of betrayal, but also a kind of a feeling that the trust has been broken and it will take a lot of work to rebuild that. And in the meantime, a lot of people in Canada will be looking to Mr. Carney to sort of, remove some of the dependence that Canada has on an integrated market with the US and sort of reorient our economy, particularly over to Europe. So we are certainly here hoping that, the first time that Donald Trump and Mark Carney meet face to face, there is respect, a mutual respect on both sides. Canada's sovereignty will be respected, and that we can put this governor and 51st state business to bed once and for all.
One more thing before we go. We asked the audience to send in some questions. Laura, sending this in. We do, of course, need to talk about tariffs before we go here. How about tariffs and trade? Donald, how does Carney plan to work with the White House moving forward? At least what has he said about what his first moves will be trade-wise with the White House?
So, as things stand, it's still straight-up economic war. We view the situation relatively fluidly. I think there would be broad consensus across, Canada, and certainly from Carney's perspective, that if there are concessions to be made from the US perspective, Canada will react in kind. We've seen some aggressive measures come from the Canadian side of the border. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, a couple of weeks ago, sort of imposed a 25% surcharge on hydroelectricity to 3 states in the US, Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, and then rescinded that after the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, got in his ear over the phone. So I think that there's a spirit of general reciprocity there. But if the Trump administration is committed to tariffs, and in particular, it seems as though the auto industry is going to be reshored fully away from Mexico and Canada towards completely domestic production in the United States, which will come at great harm, I think, to the auto sector in all 3 countries, and certainly consumers will not be benefiting from this in the short or medium term. But if that is what is intended, I think we can kind of kiss the auto sector as we have understood it since all the way back since 1965 goodbye, and there will be immense pain on the Canadian side of the border, no doubt about it. A whole bunch of towns in southwestern Ontario, the largest province in Canada, are very heavily dependent on those unionized auto sector jobs. So there'll be a lot of
decades.
You say that there is this popular support
and reskilling of unionized workers. But in terms of the broader picture for the trade war, I don't think that Carney's going to be able to magic this away. It's more about sort of making Canada bulletproof from the real deep pain that could be coming as the economic relationship continues to disentangle.
Dr. Donald Gill is an assistant professor of Canadian politics at Concordia University in Montreal. Good to see you again. Talk soon.
Thanks a million. All the best.
Slide away for a quick break. Live look at the U.S. Capitol on this Tuesday evening, 10:37 in the nation's capital, 7:37 out west. Let's take a break. Al Kempfer with us when we return.